Okay, here we will begin with the components of the argumentative dialogue. Okay, there are four stages in any sequence of argumentative dialogue. The opening stage, the confrontation stage, the argumentative stage, and the closing stage. Let's begin with the opening stage. Participants agree to engage in a specific type of dialogue. Rules should be established and should be clear to participants. There are four kinds of rules. Location rules states the kinds of speech, acts, or locutions that are allowed. For example, the questions and assertion, which questions and assertions are permissible. Turn taking and other guidelines for when or who is allowed or required to advance locutions. Commitment rules specify how each type of locution leads to the commitments on the part of the participant. Strategic win-loss rules determine what sequence of locutions constitute fulfillment of the goal of the dialogue. Confrontation stage. The stage where the issue of the dialogue must be announced, agreed upon, or clarified so that the goal of the dialogue is cleared, right? That includes some other things like defining terms, right? Everybody has to agree upon the definition of a term, what it really means. Everybody has to agree. We have to come to an agreement of, what does it mean? For example, freedom. What do we mean by freedom? It can't just be your definition and, forget about the other person. So, there has to be an agreement so the argument can work, because you can't have people having different ideas about a certain word that you're using or arguing against, right? Or for. The argumentative stage. The stage where the obligation of each party in contributing to the fulfillment of the goal, to fulfilling the goal of the dialogue must be carried out by the appropriate methods. Participants have the obligation to make serious efforts to fulfill their own goal in the dialogue. So each one has to fulfill its own goal. They also have the obligation to allow the other party to fulfill their own obligations. These obligations imply certain dialogue rules. For example, they require that participants take turns in an orderly fashion to give the other party a reasonable opportunity to reply to a question or make a point. Right? It's civil, right? It's civil. And then the closing stage. The point where the goal of the dialogue has been fulfilled, or where the participants agree that the dialogue can end. It has to come to an end, right? So there are proper ways of ending a dialogue. Participants must continue to carry on with a dialogue following the rules until the dialogue is properly closed. Participants should not try to opt illicitly, right? Just because things do not seem to be going his way or her way, right? So you can't opt out or quit because you're losing, or because you don't have good arguments, or you have to go to the end, right? Persuasive dialogues, right? There's two types. This is very important. Asymmetrical persuasion dialogue, and the other one is symmetrical persuasion dialogue. Okay, this is important to understand these two, because this is what people sometimes don't get when you're arguing. Asymmetrical, in the asymmetrical, right? That means that it doesn't, it's only one-sided in a way. Symmetry has two sides. When it's asymmetrical persuasion dialogue, the type of obligation of one participant is different from that of the other. in this kind of a dialogue. So if it's an asymmetrical dialogue, for example, normally one person gives his proposition, the other one doesn't. So they don't have anything to defend, right? They don't. It's asymmetrical, only one-sided. For example, like here he says, Carl is a committed believer in God who is trying to convince Eric that God exists. Eric is not convinced by Carl's argument and raises many doubts. Eric is not an atheist, but calls himself an agnostic. Okay, that's a fine line there between agnostic and atheist, right? Atheist normally implies that you don't believe in God, right? Any kind of God. Whereas Gnostic is that you say, well, you don't really say you don't believe in God. You just say that you don't accept another person's premise that God exists. So it's so very different, right? Even though some atheists, call themselves, well, I'm an atheist agnostic. I'm agnostic, but I'm more towards the atheist, right? Because they're trying to say that they really don't believe in God, but they're not. They don't want it to become a symmetrical dialogue because they're not saying that God doesn't exist, right? So it's a little different. The obligation in this case, because it's asymmetrical, and Carl is the one who is saying that God exists, so he has to prove it. The obligations of Carl and Eric are different types. Carl has taken upon himself to try to prove to Eric the positive thesis that God exists. Eric is a doubter. He's an agnostic. He's a doubter only. He is not trying to prove the negative thesis that God does not exist, you see? So Eric he's not saying that God doesn't exist. He just says that he doesn't believe Carl's allegations that God exists. His obligation is only to raise questions that reflect his doubt about the acceptability of Carl's argument. So, all he's saying is, well, I don't accept your premise. Carl says God exists and I believe in God, and so Eric says no, but I don't believe your premise. You have to prove to me that God exists. Now, Eric doesn't have to prove anything because he doesn't say that God doesn't exist. He's just saying he doesn't believe Carl's premise. Very different from symmetrical. In symmetrical persuasion dialogue, both participants have the same type of obligation. So in this case, if Carl says God exists and Eric says no, he does not. God does not exist. Then now they both have to prove their premise. But you see, Eric never said that God didn't. He never stated the premise that God didn't exist. He just says he doesn't believe Carl's premise. He doesn't. So you see, it's very different, one and the other, right? So one is symmetrical because in this case, when it's symmetrical, both sides have to defend their premise or their statement, right? God exists, God doesn't exist. Asymmetrical, God exists. I don't really believe what you're saying that God exists. Now that's asymmetrical. I'm not saying, right, that God doesn't exist. I just need you to show me that God exists, right? So it's very different. One symmetrical, one asymmetrical. So it's important to know the difference between that because people argue. And, that idea of between atheist and agnostic is very, very hard to tell a lot of times. So, okay, so that's the end, right? And here we have. So that's it, right?